we've got a great guest on the line, a good friend of mine, as a matter of fact, a living legend in his own right. I mean, what a great man we've got on tonight, man. I'm just looking forward to the interview. I'm stoked.
Yeah, since we started doing the show, or since I started doing the show with you last summer, I can't think of a time I've been more excited for an interview than I am tonight. We're joined on the line here by the living legend, Larry Zbyszko. Larry, how's it going?
That's going good, guys. Down here in sunny Florida. It was a good intro. Sounded good to me.
All right, so we've got some great questions for you, Larry. So if it's all right with you, we'll go ahead and get started.
I bet you do.
Now, my first question for you is, growing up, were you a wrestling fan? If so, who were some of your favorites growing up?
Well, I'll give you three guesses. When I was growing up, when I saw studio wrestling, Bruno was the guy, man, and he became my hero. And actually, kind of molded my life. And at the age of 13, I knew exactly what I wanted to be. And it was a pro wrestler, and I started wrestling in high school, wrestled in college until I punched out the assistant dean, and then started as Bruno's protege, and the rest is wrestling history. But he was the man, and he took me under his wing, and taught me the psychology, and that was a thrill of a life. It was a dream come true.
Now, obviously, training back then was a lot different than it is today. I mean, it wasn't that you could just walk into any school on the road. You kind of had to have somebody that saw something in you. Can you talk a little bit about your training?
Well, you know what? That's interesting because, there was no training. There was no schools. It was a mortal sin. It was pro wrestling was very secretive. It was like the Illuminati, it was a closed shop, and they didn't want people in the business. It was very secret, and getting in, basically, you really had to know somebody, or some of the guys excelled, like, Briscoes, or NCAA wrestling champions, or, and I was real lucky that at the time, Bruno was impressed by my amateur wrestling, and stuff, but back in those days, what they used to do when guys would come around to the arenas and bother them to become a professional wrestler, they'd stick you in the ring with someone like Carl Gotch, and he'd break your arm. And then they'd send you home, and you'd walk through the neighborhood going, "Oh my God, the guy broke my arm," and everybody in the neighborhood would believe it, and they did it on purpose to promote their business and make people believers. And in terms of training, there really was no place to go. I had a real extensive amateur background, and things were simple in those days, with arm drags and hip tosses and backdrops, but it was more about character and wrestling holds and interviews and psychology instead of, today, which has turned into nothing but kind of a meaningless bump fest. And but there really was no place to start. The only thing we did a little bit, Guido the Mongol had an old barn, and he had an old ring set up in his barn. And me and Bill Eadie, it's a funny story, me and Bill Eadie, who was Demolition and probably a couple other guys, we used to go to Guido's barn and go over simple things, like backdrops and hip tosses and some, simple holds and stuff. But then it was funny. After we used to do that, I went one way, Bill went another, and I didn't see Bill for like 30 years. And then once in a while, I see him now at autographs conventions or something. But back in the old days, it was kind of like you learned in the ring in front of the crowd. There was nowhere to practice, and very hard getting in the pro wrestling business because they didn't want you in.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about back then and how it was different. Now, of course, your first major program was with your mentor, Bruno Sammartino, who you later turned against. Can you talk a little bit about that era of your career where you actually became the living legend and your relationship with Bruno?
Yeah. It was an interesting time, but again, I was a pretty young guy back then. But for like 5 or 6 years, I came into the business and was billed as Bruno's protege. In fact, I used to work out with Bruno at his house and did the same workout he did, a lot of heavy chest and and stuff. And I even had kind of a similar look. I even moved like Bruno, you know. But after about 5 or 6 years of being his protege, it got kind of to an interesting crossroads of my career and Bruno's, because Bruno at this time was now a little over 40, and maybe 6, 8 months before that, he broke his neck when Stan Hansen dropped him. And Bruno basically retired from the ring, you know, and he stopped wrestling, and he started doing the color commentating. And I was in a position where I was, you know, like well known, and everybody loved me because I was Bruno's protege. But then at the same time, I was kind of stuck in that position and kind of lost in Bruno's shadow. So then it came time for, you know, for me to make a move. And everything I learned from all these guys, Bruno and Strongbows and Skolins and Monsoons and all these guys that would take me under their wing. And it was kind of like politics, too, because I was Bruno's guy, so they all helped me out, you know, for brownie points. But I came to the crossroads where I realized, because of the shape of the business, when Bruno retired, you got to understand, Bruno sold out places for 20 years. I mean, if it wasn't for Bruno, there would have been no WWF or WWF. In fact, when Bruno retired, the WWF was on the verge of bankruptcy because for some reason the McMahons wanted to push Bob Backlund, and the fans just puked on the guy. I mean, it was like you couldn't follow Bruno with Bob Backlund, and the business was on the skids. So, you know, and I knew, you know, whoever, you know, if Bruno made a comeback, whoever did it with Bruno would become a big name. So I came up with the idea of, you know, trying to irritate Bruno enough to get him out of retirement for a special match, and wrestling history then proceeded, and it got so big, and we finally had to leave the Garden because the Garden wasn't big enough. So in the days when it was unheard of, we wound up taking it to Shea Stadium, and not only did we draw 45,000 people, which was unheard of in those days, they turned thousands of people away. So it was, you know, it was an amazing thing for the time. It was still wrestling history that's unbeatable.
Yeah. Now, of course, Rowdy Piper said that you headlined the event that had to take place in order for WrestleMania to take place, the Showdown at Shea. Talk a little bit about that event, if you can.
You mean the Shea Stadium event?
Yeah.
Well, I tell you, that was the most exciting thing of my life. And at that time, the biggest thing of pro wrestling, actually, it put pro wrestling on the map and at the attention of a new era. And the new era was the birth of nationwide cable. And, you know, like Piper said, opened the doorway because television companies and the cable industry recognized, you know, after Shea Stadium, because it was all over the news, you know, pro wrestling outdraws the Mets. And we really put pro wrestling on the map. And it opened the door to where pro wrestling then got so much notoriety for that event that it wound up, you know, on national cable networks, which were springing up. And that was like the big step that took wrestling from the days of the territories to the days of the nationwide promotions. But it was like, you know, that was a time when the world was changing and television was changing and cable was coming into existence and all that. It was really an exciting time. It was like the end of one age and the beginning of another. The me and Bruno feud was, you know, probably the biggest feud ever in the days of the old school. And it was right after that you know, the business went into a metamorphosis and changed and, you know, into a little different kind of business.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people remember Ted DiBiase buying the WWF belt, but you were the first to do that in the NWA when you purchased the NWA National Heavyweight title from Tim Brooks in 1983. That was a brand new concept. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, that's very good of you to know that. Yeah. Other WWE copied a lot of stuff I did, but the secret was doing it first. But, yeah, back in 1983, I was always taught, psychology-wise, and one of the secrets of the business is to always do what the fans don't expect, because then it was exciting and it got them interested, and they got into it emotionally. So back then it was never heard of, but we did a little thing because everybody expected me to win the belt. So we always threw a swerve in. So instead of me winning it, I helped Killer Brooks screw Paul Orndorff out of it, and then I bought the belt from Killer Brooks for $25,000 and strutted around and people just continued, people hating my guts. And then, of course, being still at 27 or 8 years old, 9 years old, calling myself the living legend just pissed them off more. But yeah, that was a classic angle of of that era. I mean, people, it's amazing how different the business was. I mean, today it's kind of like silly, but back then it was serious heat, brother. I mean, in those days, we caused riots every night. I walked out of a building one time I was shot at. I had riots, I got stabbed, I had cars smashed, I was overturned in cabs. People would get heart attacks in the audience and drop dead during the matches because they were so into it. It was a wild time. There should be a movie made about how wrestling really was. In fact, I'll give you a scoop. We'll find out what happens later in the week, but there's some people putting together, they're going to be making a movie about the life of Bruno. And it's going to be interesting, and I'm going to be in it, and we'll see how it goes. But those were days. I wish this generation could have a chance to go back in time and experience what wrestling used to be like, and see where the present day pro wrestling, really came from and how it was, because it was so night and day, and the excitement and the emotions. We used to vibrate giant arenas in the days before they had music and fireworks and strippers running around and all this nonsense. It was classic.
Mm-hmm. Now, when the Crockett family had a change in leadership in 1988, you were left without an angle. Why do you feel that was?
I was left without an angle?
Yeah.
Well, that. Let me plug my book. You've got to get The Adventures in Larryland, and that story is one of the classic stories in there, too. I'll give you some spoilers, but it was funny because in those days, 88, there was a couple things going on. It was the Crockett's, which were kind of getting run into the ground with bad booking on one hand of it, but their mother, stopped giving them money, so they were about to close the doors, and then it became WCW. But the funny bit about those days were, they brought me in because they wanted me to do this thing with Baby Doll and Dusty Rhodes, and Baby Doll had a secret envelope, which people still talk about today and ask me what was in that envelope Baby Doll had, and me and Baby Doll were going to blackmail Dusty Rhodes with this stuff. And it was really getting over hot, and people were into it. And then Baby Doll was supposed to come out on television and grab Dusty and give him the big, giant kiss of death. She was supposed to kiss him, and that was supposed to be the kiss of death for Dusty Rhodes. But the twist is, Baby Doll just married this idiot, Sam Houston. And Sam Houston was all jealous and freaking out, and Baby Doll was in a panic, and we did this television spot, and there's Dusty standing there, and Baby Doll was doing this thing, but instead of giving him this big kiss, which was supposed to be the kiss of death, she didn't want to have her husband freak out and go apeshit, so she didn't kiss Dusty, she just walked off. And the Crockett's got so pissed off that they fired Baby Doll the next day. And the angle never finished, and the secrets of the envelope were never revealed. Baby Doll actually still has the envelope with the pictures today.
Oh, wow. That's actually pretty incredible.
Now, on February, there's a lot more of that in my book.
I'm definitely going to have to pick up a copy. Now, on February 7th,
I don't have a copy yet. Amazon.
I know, right? I've hung out with you and kicked it, and I don't have a copy. I'll be the first to admit I still need to go get a copy.
Shame on you.
I know, right? But my next question for you is on February 7th, 1989. You won the AWA World Heavyweight Championship. Talk about the events that took place that evening, please.
Well, it was kind of interesting. I mean, I had a choice back in those days. It was, again, the Crockett era was ending. Their mother wouldn't give them any more money because they were not doing business properly, and the NWA was kind of breaking up, and the Turner people came in, and it was starting to turn to WCW. And they wanted me to come into WCW on one hand, and on the other hand, the Gagnes wanted me to come back to the AWA. And I made the decision because I knew there was going to be a lot of confusion and stuff in the WCW transformation, from the Crockett thing. And the AWA was on ESPN, so they were having nationwide exposure too. So I went to the AWA, and I got along real good with the Gagnes. And at that time, it was my father-in-law, so that helped, even though he didn't like me at first. But, so I took that because it was always good to keep yourself on top on national television. So I went back to the AWA, and I was supposed to go back and wrestle Jerry Lawler, because Lawler had the AWA strap at the time. So on the way back, when I get to the AWA, Lawler didn't want to work with me. He freaked out for some reason, and he took off and disappeared with the AWA belt. And then Vern had to threaten to sue him and all that. So Jerry, guy that he is, took a sledgehammer and dented the belt up and sent it back so he wouldn't get sued. And that was the old belt, the kind of like the Bockwinkel had. So actually the belt I had was actually, they made another belt, and the AWA belt I still have is actually a copy of the first pro wrestling belt ever made back around 1890. And it was made by the Boston Police Gazette for Frank Muldoon. And if you look at the belt closely, you'll see the belt is shaped like a police badge, the main, the part of the belt, because the Boston Police Gazette, which made the first championship belt, made it in the shape of a police badge. So I went up there, and it worked out good for me because I had publicity, from ESPN, and ESPN Classics. They're still showing that stuff from the mid-'80s and '89 and '90. From the AWA. In fact, it's funny because when the ESPN started playing that, like 3-4 years ago, I've been playing it. It was on for about a year or so, and I went backstage one day to TNA and say hi to some of the guys. And all the younger guys who were too young to remember me in those days, like AJ and Daniels and The Abyss and Storm and all those guys, they used to run up to me and they were horrified. They said, "We were watching the AWA Classics, and oh my God, you were such an asshole." Oh, they couldn't believe it. But that was the secret of getting the heat. Unfortunately, a lost art.
Oh yeah, I would have to agree with you on that. Now, you were the last AWA champion. How does it feel to know that you were the last man to hold that belt?
Well, it feels cool. I mean, in the days, in terms of real business, it was kind of interesting because actually Vern would have shut down the AWA a couple of years before he did, saved some millions of dollars. But now, it became wrestling history, and it's kind of cool. I mean, I still got the, AWA belt, and it's cool to be part of wrestling history and doing that. So I've had some good things happen to me. I had a blessed career, from pulling off the biggest thing ever at the end of the old school with Bruno and becoming the most hated for years. And I actually still have the Western States Heritage Championship belt. When the Crockett's, folded their tent, I was the Western States belt. In fact, Jack's Pacific, the ones that came out with the TNA dolls, they also did a series called the NWA Legends. And they got a doll of me coming out any time now, which is going to be me with the Western States Heritage belt on, for Jack. So that should be coming out like any time because the TNA dolls were out And then the NWA Legend Series is going to be coming out. So that'll be exciting. So I'll have
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, it should be out any time.
Nice. Now, my co-host Andrew Carlick has some questions. So, Andrew, go ahead, man.
Yeah, Larry. You were talking a moment ago about how you felt that Vern should have closed down a year or two before he actually did. Now, do you actually feel that it was a few years earlier when, like, the Hulk Hogan and Bobby Heenan and Gene Okerlund, that was that time, or did you feel that they kept it going pretty well for a couple of years after that?
Well, you know what? I mean, the time that all the guys left the territories was, some years before that. That was in the early '80s. And Vince made kind of a bold move in the days when cable started, and what he did is, in those days there was no contract. Everything was a handshake and a 2-week notice. And when wrestling went nationwide, McMahon had a great idea. He stole every territory's top talent at the time. He grabbed Hogan and Heenan and Okerlund and Jesse from the AWA, and then he grabbed Piper and Snook and some other guys from the NWA. This was like the early '80s. And then he grabbed I forget his name, somebody from the Bill Watts territory, a couple from here and there. So when he went nationwide, he would have an audience from all over the area of the old territories. And Vern could have easily stayed in business and done good because he was also on nationwide cable with ESPN. The problem with Vern was he just didn't promote it right. He was stuck in an era that was over. And he didn't know how to change. And if you watch the AWA stuff in the mid-'80s, it was still, going, pretty good. But then by, 86, 87, 88, it was the same guys. I mean, Nick Bockwinkel was still wrestling, and Nick was great, but it was already time, for the new wave of guys. Greg Gagne was still getting pushed, was not good. And he still had, Baron von Raschke and Ray Steele. I mean, Vern just didn't change with the times in time. So by the time 1989 came around, it was at the point where, it was just time to shut the doors, and, that Vern didn't want to, and it was no big deal. I mean, he's an old timer that didn't want to give up without a fight, but he just didn't know how to do it right. He was still kind of, in the old school ways, and the business was changing. And so, anyway, that was the history of that.
Okay, now, after that, you actually went back to the NWA, and this was just on the verge of it becoming WCW, and you would never leave until, WCW went out of business. Now, does it fill you with any kind of pride that you actually went there and stayed there, especially considering over the next 10 years or so, there was a lot of wrestlers that were jumping ship and going back and forth between WCW, WWF, back and forth?
Oh yeah, well, I had a great run there, and it kind of worked out pretty good because right after it's an interesting story because the AWA, like in around 90 or so, they knew the business was, getting ready to shut the doors unless they could pull something out of their butts. And WCW was just starting up, and they needed something to get themselves off to a good start too, because they were just starting up. And actually, it's an interesting story because at that time, me and Greg Gagne and a couple other guys, they put together an idea of an invasion angle where the AWA would invade WCW. One from ESPN cable against the one on TBS. And it was a great idea at the time, and they wanted me, who had the AWA belt, to, invade with some other guys and have a match against one of their new guys named Sting, who wound up with the WCW, position there. And it was a great idea that never happened because one of the old school promoters, a guy named Jim Barnett, scared the TBS people because he told them He said, well, you've got to be careful because, Zbyszko, he's what they call a hooker, and if he wants to, he can take this kid's sting and make him look really bad and make our belt look bad and our company look bad. And he was into this old school phobia of something that, would have never happened anyway, but he scared the TBS people. So the invasion of AWA into WCW never happened. And the AWA, shut the doors. But they wanted me to come to WCW anyway. So, they made me a great offer. So I went to, WCW, did some wrestling, wound up tag teaming with Arn as the Enforcers. And that was really great. Arn was great. And then, but the interesting part of the story was, to make a long story short, then around 1997, when some things happened and we had a chance to make it big, because Ted released money and wanted to do a Monday night show, the guys in the office at WCW was Greg Gagne, a guy that came from the AWA that I took care of because he was, didn't know shit. His name was Eric Bischoff, Mike Graham, and me. And what we did was we took the idea that never happened of the AWA invasion angle, and we brought in Scott Hall, Nash, and Six Pack, and we called it the New World Order. And it became the hottest thing wrestling ever had.
And we'll definitely get into a little bit more detail on the New World Order in a little bit. Have a lot of questions about them. But in those early days of WCW, you were part of one of the first great tag teams called the Enforcers, consisting of yourself and Arn Anderson. Now, can you talk a little bit about working with a master of the tag team art like Arn? And also a little bit later, you worked with another tag team expert in Bobby Eaton.
Well, Bobby was he was like a professional tag team guy. They always teamed Bobby with somebody because he was a great technical wrestler, nice guy, but he couldn't talk good. So he really couldn't be a single wrestler because he couldn't talk good. So, but he was always a tag team guy, here and there with somebody. But Arn was great. Arn was a classic. I mean, Arn could have been a great singles guy. He always wound up kind of in the Four Horsemen or a tag situation because they used to put Arn in positions, to carry the weight of other guys. And but me and Arn and I wasn't big on tag teams. I didn't, like being a tag team guy because there was more money and more notoriety in being a single, being a star and being your own guy. And that's what I, was for years. But me and Arn clicked, it was, the Enforcers was something that clicked. And even in the days we did it in the early 90s when we'd walk out, you could feel the heat. You could feel the people pop and buzz when me and Arn walked out. And it really was getting over good. And we did some classic stuff with Kazmaier, and we broke Barry Windham's arm, and had some classics with Steamboat and some other guys, and then we got involved in the constantly changing politics of WCW, where every 6 months they had a different fearless leader that gummed up the works. And then unfortunately, when the Enforcers was going hot and heavy, Bill Watts came in and started screwing everything up. So that's kind of another story. And then that's when I took myself out of the ring because I didn't want to get buried by nonsense after working hard for almost 20 years. I don't want to have anybody kill my career, so I kind of slipped out of the wrestling and went into the broadcasting. But if it would have been done right, the team of the Enforcers, could have been a long-term thing that would have been really cool. I used to drive Arn nuts too because he had the philosophy of bumping around, and I was one of the few guys who could just stand there and drive a crowd nuts. But together, it really worked out to be a cool team. Good luck.
Arn's one of my couple favorite guys of all time. Now, we actually got a couple questions from our fans on our Facebook fan page, and one of those questions was, which promoter was the easiest and the most difficult to work with over your career?
Oh, God. Well, you know what? The easiest one for me that I got along with was Vern Gagne. Vern was an old school guy who was a tough son of a bitch. I mean, a tough wrestler. And he was a guy that liked guys that knew how to wrestle. So me and Vern, always got along good because I was a wrestling, kind of heel guy, and he respected it, and we got along real good. The hardest people to get along with were basically the McMahons for me, because they had the mindset, especially in those days, when Bruno was around, that guys had to be really big. If you didn't weigh 300 pounds, the McMahons didn't think you could draw money. And, those are probably the most difficult to work with. The other guys, like the Southern guys, like when you went to the Crockett's or Southern, it was real cliquey. I mean, you always had like the Dusty clique, and it was real cliquey. And I was never a guy that was good at kissing ass. So, and I was good enough to where I didn't have to do that. But Vern was good to work with because he was a wrestler and he appreciated guys that could wrestle. So that worked out smooth.
Now, we were talking about the early years in WCW, and you touched briefly on some of the leaders there. Can you talk about the leadership changes? Because it was almost like a carousel in those early years before, pretty much until Eric Bischoff took control.
Well, it was. It was like it never really gave. I mean, WCW, like the WWF, it went through a stale period. But at WCW, it was corporate. And it never had a good boss that knew anything about the business. When I first went there, I was brought in by this guy named Jim Herd. And Jim Herd was a nice guy. But when I found out that his experience was he managed the Pizza Huts, I said, oh my God, this guy doesn't have a clue what he's getting into. And he didn't. So 6 months later, they replaced him with this lawyer named Kip Fry. And Kip Fry, another guy who's never been involved in the wrestling business, did not have a clue what to do. And then they finally found a bunch of dirty magazines and Prozacs in his desk and got rid of him. And then, they kept struggling trying. In the meantime, Ole Anderson was kind of in and out, pulling his hair out, because every time he wanted to do something, the TBS people would want to do something different. They didn't have a clue. Then they decided that they'd go with the wrestling guy and brought Bill Watts in. And after about 6 months, they were pulling their hair out and threw Bill Watts out because he drove them nuts. He was such a goof. And then Bischoff kind of came along and stumbled into a thing that was just kind of, the old saying, just a luck out where you're at the right place at the right time. And, Bischoff kind of beefed up some made-up resume, and for some reason, they picked Bischoff, but as soon as Bischoff, got his chance, Ted Turner came out of the woodwork and said, he was a big fan, God bless him. He wanted to start a Monday show to compete with Raw. And Ted finally released enough money that we could work with. And it worked out good that Bischoff lucked out and got that position because Eric didn't know what to do. But he was surrounded by a couple guys like me and Greg and Mike that he listened to. And I was the guy who programmed the whole beginning of the invasion angle, which was the old AWA idea. And, how he brought Scott in and then Six Pack and then Nash. And, so Bischoff used to listen, and we got it started off so good, which you have to do. And it, got over huge. And unfortunately, after a year or so, Bischoff, head kind of swelled up, and now he thinks he knows it all. He's hanging around with Hogan and some other guys, and before you know it, unfortunately, everything went downhill and turned to crap. But that's showbiz.
Now, you were talking earlier about how you took yourself out of the ring, but you've made a very smooth transition into the broadcasting booth. How did that come about? Was that your idea, or was that something they came to you with?
It was another act of God in terms of destiny. because like I said, Bill Watts was coming in at that time and really starting to mess things up. And his idea was everybody over 40 was not good, and it's time to push the 20-year-old kids. But that was bullshit, because the only kid he pushed was Eric Watts. And then one day I saw he had Eric Watts wrestling Arn Anderson, and Eric Watts beats Arn on TV, and the fans shit on it. I mean, it was so totally unbelievable and horrifying. And I said, oh, my God, so the company's going to die again. So what I did at the time, I actually lucked out, and my one knee started bothering me, some cartilage, So I said, oh, hey, I got to get my knee scoped. So I took myself out of the wrestling and out of the Dangerous Alliance and got my knee fixed and was sitting around the house, for a couple months and taking it easy and not wanting to rush back to the ring because I know Bill Watts was screwing everything up. So while I'm sitting there getting paid, God bless him, they had Jesse the Body doing some color, but then their budget, they didn't, Bill Watts didn't want to pay anybody, so he cut Jesse and got rid of him, and then one of the producers asked me if I would sit in and do some of the voiceovers, because they needed a color guy. So I went, yeah, I'll sit and do some color. So I went down and did some voiceovers on some of the shows, and this producer runs out, and he's like going ape shit, and he says, God, Larry, that's the greatest shit I've ever heard. And I was just kind of a natural. It just came to me. But so then they offered me a deal to be a broadcaster. I mean, a hell of a deal. I said, you got to be kidding. So at first it was kind of irritating because I was thinking, well, God, I'm the living legend here, and now I'm going to become Tony Schiavone. So I said, well, but I thought about it, and the wrestling was getting so messed up. Then I said, yeah, this will be great. And thank God, because it worked out to be like almost 10 years gig, but the broadcasting was great. And, I wound up getting more publicity than most guys that were doing the wrestling. Most guys my age were already getting phased out, and I was getting over more than anybody doing the broadcasting without getting beat up. And, that was the best job in the business. And you know what? It's too bad nowadays they don't realize how important the broadcast team is. I mean, if you don't have a good color guy to bring this stuff to life and good announcers, you're not going to have a good TV show.
Right, yeah. I think that the wrestling business sorely misses a guy like Tony Schiavone. But, talking about your broadcasting, you always had a way of kind of making the fans think a little bit. And I think a whole lot of fans shit on that because they didn't want to think. They wanted to watch guys beat each other up. You came up with the...
People loved me. I mean, I used to come out every night telling the thousands of people every Monday night would chant Larry. I was the most over broadcaster they ever had.
Right, yeah, and you also came up with a lot of those catchphrases that came to be synonymous catchphrases, or I say catchphrases, but terms like the human chest and things like that.
The human game of chess. Tony Schiavone used to put me on the spot. I remember one time Norman Smiley was doing some goofy thing, and Tony goes, "What's that, Larry?" I spurred a moment. I said, "It's a big wiggle. It's a big wiggle." And it got Norman over.
Yeah, it was just the number of terms that stayed in the years in WCW that came from you was just way too numerous to mention. But you did come out of the booth a couple times to get back into wrestling a little bit. Now, the first time was in 1994, where you feuded with Lord Steven Regal. And I vividly remember this starting. I remember it was one of the Saturday morning shows or something like that, where he was out there and he was talking bad about the Americans. And your gripe there was that you had just paid your income taxes. And that kind of got that whole thing in motion.
Well, you know what? It was interesting because I was doing the broadcasting for a few years, and I was trying to help the guys out because in those days the quality of the wrestling matches was going down the tubes, and wrestling was pretty stale. It was already old news that all these guys full of steroids, like Lex Luger and all them, they looked great, but they couldn't do anything. So all they did was stand there with their arm out, and everybody kept clotheslining everybody. So I see this guy, Lord Regal, and Regal was great. I mean, he could wrestle, he could talk, he had that look, and WCW had no idea what to do with him. So I said, here's what we'll do. So I programmed the whole thing where I basically kind of did me and Bruno, only this time I came out of the broadcast booth and worked a couple-month program with Regal, because I wanted to set an example so these guys could see what a wrestling match used to be. And I remember, TBS, the ratings were down, and me and Regal went on PBS and did like a 30-minute match the first time and blew the ratings off the chart. And we went like 30 minutes without throwing one clothesline. And I remember Brian Pillman running around the back freaking out with some other guys going, oh, my God, they just put on a clinic. They didn't throw one clothesline. It was the greatest match. And the people were going nuts. So I was trying to give them some examples. Plus, coming out of the broadcast booth once in a while, kept my character over. So that was good, too. So, all around it worked out good. And I hope it helped Regal get noticed because he was a great talent.
Right, and you're definitely right, where it seemed like they didn't know what to do with him. They just kind of stuck that television title on him, and he pretty much let everything go to that 15-minute draw that they had.
Their mentality, I mean, the company's being run by people that don't have a clue, and all they did, and unfortunately, their TNA still doing it today, they just copy Vince. They go, well, Vince McMahon's got all these steroid guys doing clotheslines, so we must have steroid guys doing clotheslines. But at the same time, the business was stale. So, tried to help them out. But finally, we got a chance to help them out, and they've got the hottest it ever got.
Now, you talked earlier about when the beginning of Nitro. What was the general feeling within the company and within the locker room when they were finally going to have a real flagship show to go opposed to WWF?
Oh, well, it was exciting. Everybody was excited about it, and not only was it good for the boys because Turner was releasing enough money to do it, it was good for the business. I mean, at that time, the business was stale. And the people needed something new. And, it was programmed so beautiful with the invasion. I mean, it was the most exciting thing that happened to wrestling since me and Bruno sold out Shea Stadium. And it was unbelievable. I mean, even in the end of the 90s when everybody thought they were so smart and talking, with all their little stooge sheets and all that, we still had people diving over the balconies trying to punch out Bischoff and losing their minds and throwing stuff in the ring. I mean, just like the old days, So we still got them, and unfortunately, the way things are now, those end of the 90s, that's the biggest and the hottest that pro wrestling's ever going to be.
Now, that actually goes very well into my next question, and we could talk a little bit about the NWO. And, I was surprised a little earlier when you said that you came with that invasion angle for the AWA, which later became the NWO, because the story's always been that was an angle that Eric Bischoff took from Japan. So I guess they were just trying to avoid giving you the credit for that. Can you talk a little bit about the NWO?
Well, yeah. Well, the NWO, like I said, was an idea. Of course, I mean, everybody takes credit for everything, but that was an idea that came from the AWA. And at the time, the people in the office was, Bischoff, Greg Gagne, Mike Graham, and I wasn't in the office because I didn't want to hang out in the office all day. I wanted to golf, but I was there enough doing the broadcasting where I was always talking to people. So I was the one, actually, me and Greg were the ones that, along with Eric, because Eric came from the AWA, from, doing the Larry Nelson interview thing. And that's where the idea came from. We took the idea that never happened and just turned it around. So instead of it looking like the AWA was invading, we made it look like the WWF was invading WCW by doing what Vince did. He stole guys years before from the promoters, and we turned around and stole his guys and formed the New World Order.
And if I'm not mistaken, it was to where before Kevin Nash and Scott Hall started using their names, WWE filed a lawsuit saying that they were playing Diesel and Razor Ramon.
Oh, I'm sure they did. I mean, I wasn't involved in any of that, but I'm sure they lost because we weren't using those names. They were using their real names.
Right. I think it actually came to where on an event, Eric Bischoff had to ask them if they worked for the WWF, and they had to say no. But the next time you came out of the booth was during this NWO angle, and the feud centered around Scott Hall, but it really kept going. You had a match at Starrcade of that year with Eric Bischoff. You had your match with Scott Hall where Dusty Rhodes joined the NWO. And
yeah, Dusty was begging. He had to get in.
And it also included a wrestler that not a lot of people today are aware of, a deceased wrestler by the name of Louis Spicolli. Can you talk about that angle and working with Scott? Because not only in addition to the matches, you were, for months before then, you were working with, you were kind of getting in there and costing Scott Hall matches and things like that.
Well, again, it was a classic build-up. I mean, I programmed the New World Order, where we had Scott come in and do it this way and some other guys. And then what happened is kind of interesting because I was doing the broadcasting. And at one time, before we had the one set built, we were broadcasting by the ring. We had a table set up by the ring. And one time we went to a commercial break. And during the commercial break, Scott, was in the ring, and he came over and threw a toothpick at me, just shitting around. So I threw off the headphones and stood up. And when I did that, the crowd exploded. I mean, the crowd popped so loud that Hogan and Bischoff, who didn't see what we were doing, covered their heads with their hands and ducked because it sounded like a bomb went off, and they had no idea what happened. And me and Scott looked at each other, and right away, we knew, holy shit, this is money. So right after that show, I went to Bischoff, and I said, okay, look, here's what we're going to do, because they were freaking out how loud the pop was, So I programmed the whole thing with me, and Scott, and people were going nuts. They were dying to see it. But then, just like in the days of Killer Brooks, we threw a swerve in. And before I wrestled Scott, we put the swerve in where I wrestled Bischoff. And I set things up and programmed me and Bischoff to where, Bischoff had a ton of heat on him. And at the same time, people were drooling that I would finally get in the ring with Scott Hall. And then we made it even bigger because if I beat Bischoff, I'll save Nitro from the control of the New World Order. And I did the two pay-per-views that we programmed, the one where I wrestled Bischoff and then sold out where I wrestled Hall, were the two biggest buy rates WCW ever did. In fact, I think they were the two biggest buy rates the wrestling world may have already ever done.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you were also scheduled, I was talking about Louis Spicolli, you were scheduled to wrestle him a couple months down the road, but, that was right after he unfortunately passed.
Oh, poor Louis. Well, you know what? It was sad. Louis, good kid, a tragic story, but yeah, I mean, right after I wrestled Scott Hall, we were already setting up a Spicolli thing with the ledge and the pledge, and Louis was stealing my golf clubs, and it was actually a week before the pay-per-view in the Cow Palace in San Francisco. And it was weird because I was at some kiddie place, where kids jump around in balls and when they have birthday parties. So I was at some kiddie place with one of my kids for a birthday party in Atlanta. And I was walking out of the door, and who was coming at me with his kid was J.J. Dillon.
Huh.
And J.J. came up to me and he said, hey, did you hear about Louis? Louis died. And I thought he was kidding. I said, what are you talking about? And, unfortunately, Louis, died a week before we were supposed to have that match at the San Francisco Cow Palace. It never happened. That's too bad. But yeah, that was gonna plan. But then after that, I just went back to the broadcasting.
Okay. Now, towards the end of WCW, you were involved in another quote unquote stable that that they had, a group called the Old Age Outlaws. What did you think about being part of the Old Age Outlaws? Obviously, a play off the WWF's tag team, the New Age Outlaws.
That was a very brief thing, and that was already in the time, unfortunately, when people at WCW, the upper echelon people, already knew that the show was getting canceled, and it was kind of just running temporarily on a real low budget. And then they had some guys that came in that were totally off the wall, which was these Russo guys, and they had some guy named Bill, an accountant in charge, and the accountant was in charge just because no more money was going into it. It was actually, those were the days it was kind of crumbling, and they were grabbing at straws, and the programming all went to hell, and it was too bad. But it was fun seeing some of the other guys. Terry Funk was a riot, but that was a very short-lived, quick thing that could have been really a little better, but the people running it didn't have a clue. We were back to people running it that didn't have a clue stage already. So, well, yeah, and again, it was too bad because we had this guy Goldberg that was hot as hell, and the people are chanting Goldberg, and who's the heavyweight champion of the world? The idiotic writer. I mean, so how stupid can you get? It was already dead, and then AOL was going to cancel it anyway, so it just got canceled.
Now, we've heard a lot of horror stories about the atmosphere in the WCW locker room. What was it like for you? Did you spend a lot of time in there, and what kind of things did you see?
No, you know what? For me, I had a great time. I was under contracting doing the broadcasting, which meant I worked like a day a week or a day and a half a week. So in those days, I was already, probably getting in the upper 40s, and I knew the wrestling business, WCW, was crumbling and about to get canceled. So I was just golfing a lot. And I didn't hang around the dressing room, and, they had a new crew of younger guys that were probably pretty depressed because they were just about to get a break, and then it was canceled. But, I already had my break and did my stuff, so I was just kind of floating in the pool and golfing a lot. But I'm sure the dressing room, there's probably a lot of guys that were just hoping to get a break, and then, of course, they had to watch it, crumble. So that's too bad for them.
All right, now JT's back, and he's got a couple more questions. So, JT, go ahead.
Yeah. Now, what are some of your memories of your time in the WWA? Of course, WWA being the World Wrestling All-Stars.
Well, you know what? That's interesting. I never really worked there, but one time after Vince and this idiot Jericho pissed me off, they tried to steal the living legend and call Jericho the living legend. Because for some reason Vince wanted to give him a push, and he bombed. And I wouldn't let him steal my life. That was my thing, just like the Nature Boy and the American Dream and the Hulk. And it's not my fault Jericho wasn't big enough to get over, but I wouldn't let him steal my stuff. So the guy at the WWA called me, and I said, yeah, let me. So they flew me out to Vegas, and all I did for them was an interview. Because I had it with McMahon's nonsense and his lawyers trying to, write me nasty letters telling me they're going to steal my stuff, try to get me to sign it away for nothing. And I said, go to hell. So I went on the WWA and did a hell of an interview telling Vince that, okay, why don't you get in the ring with me, Vince, if you always thought you were a tough guy anyway. But, of course, he never would. But it gave me a chance to get out in the open, what these pricks were trying to do. And so, but you know what? I've been trying to find a copy of that. You guys don't know anybody. Is there any way to find a copy of that WWA thing they did from Las Vegas?
I can definitely look around on some torrent sites after we get done with this interview.
I don't know if that guy Manus ever released anything. I think he was from Australia. But yeah, they did some stuff there, and I did a classic interview, and I was trying to find that thing. It was really cool. Me and Scott could do a cool last call about it. I never really typed it in YouTube. I don't know if it's out there or not. I'll have to check that out and see if it's around. But yeah, I did a cool promo. But that's all I did for them, and then I don't think they lasted very long.
Okay. Now, what are some of your memories of being in TNA, and what do you feel personally about the company?
Well, TNA, I love TNA. I mean, it was fun. I mean, again, I was, seeing this new group starting, and at that time I lived in Atlanta, and they were going up in Nashville. So me and Terry would drive up, and it was fun. It was fun, trying to help them get going. And TNA is kind of an interesting story too, because the Jarretts started it off, and they had a backer who was a surgeon, and the surgeon didn't want anybody to find out he was backing TNA. And make a long story short, people did find out he was backing TNA, so he pulled out. So shortly after TNA started in Nashville, they were about to shut the doors because Jerry Jarrett didn't want to put any money in it because he knew better. And it was almost going to just go under. And at the same time, a woman named Dixie Carter was in Nashville starting some kind of marketing company. And she really didn't have anybody to market. I think she was starting to market TNA, and then she had a couple of country western singers maybe or something, but it started something. But then TNA was about to close, and Dixie didn't want to lose a client and have something to market. So she asked her dad, Bob Carter, a billionaire from Texas, to buy TNA for her. So TNA was very lucky because they were almost non-existent, but then Bob Carter decided, okay, well, I'll buy it for Dixie and give her something to market. And that's how TNA stuck around. And I stuck around, and I worked with them for about 5 years, and it was fun. I mean, the Carters were very nice people. They were fun to work with, and they had a bunch of great talents, some new guys like an AJ Styles and Chris Daniels and The Abyss, and then we brought Samoa Joe and some other guys. I mean, they had, James Storm and Chris. I mean, they had some good stuff going, and it was fun helping a new group get off the ground. And then they moved to Orlando, and I moved to Orlando, so that worked out great too because they were right there. So I kept working with them. They never had a lot of money, but it was fun working with them, and I still wish them the best. I think they should do some things a little different because they're getting stuck in the mud. But, hopefully they'll keep going, I don't even know. I mean, I don't watch it. I mean, because what they're doing now, I can't watch. But I wish them the best of luck. The Carters are very nice people. And for the sake of the talent and the fans, I hope it keeps going and goes good. But they're going to have to do some changes.
Mm-hmm. Now, real quick, one of our sponsors, WrestleFull.com, says they have a copy of that, so I'll definitely get with you after we get off the air. They've got a copy of that interview. Yes.
Oh, great. You know what? Do you have my email address?
No, I'll get it from you when we get off the air, though.
Okay, yeah, I'll give it to you. Send me. That would be great. Me and Scott can do a last call over that promo. That was great.
Now, one of our friends actually sent in the following question. They want to know what you do on your spare time these days.
Well, that's a good question. A lot of the times I golf. Florida is like golf heaven. So I'm just kicking back. I golf. Like today was an exciting. I didn't do too much. I laid by the pool for a few hours, so I'm nice and dark and brown. And me and Scott Hall, we did a last call, and now we're here at the school. So Monday and Wednesday we run some classes and have some students here. And once a month we run a show called I Believe in Orlando where the students can work and that. And then what I do, I did a couple movies last year, like one in Seattle where, JT was at the Ultimate Death Match. And then I did a cool movie called Dead by Friday, which is going to be in some theaters, it looks, in May. They got a premiere here in Orlando April 1st. And that was a very good movie. It's a mob movie called Dead by Friday, so I'll keep the world informed when it's coming out. And I got a couple more movies I'm doing this year. In fact, we've been talking about doing a sequel to the Dead by Friday. And Sony TV, there's a TV pilot that I'm involved with. And we had a meeting last week with some people that want to film a reality show pilot with me and Scott and some of the students and some crazy things we do. So I'm always doing a little something. On the weekends, I fly out and do appearances. With WrestleMania Day, I'll be at some casino in Fort Lauderdale doing an autograph thing before the pay-per-views. So it's kind of fun. And during the week, I kind of like lounge around and do a little movie bit here and there, do some appearances on the weekends, and play a lot of golf.
Nice. Now, do you have a rib or a road story you can share with our listeners?
Do I what?
Do you have a rib or a road story that you can share with our listeners?
A rib or a road story? Oh, God, I got a million of them. I wouldn't know where to start. Oh, God, give me a hint.
How about just something funny that you've either seen done in a locker room or you've done to somebody?
Oh, God. Well, you know what? When it came to ribs, I didn't like to rib guys because some of these guys were crazy, and I didn't want to get ribbed back. I mean, there was guys like, Mr. Fuji. If you fell asleep in the dressing room, he'd lay tape over your boots and light it on fire. So you'd wake up and look at your foot, and your foot was on fire. The only ribs that I used to pull sometimes because they were safe for me is I was one of the few guys, me and Ronnie and Jimmy Garvin, we used to fly airplanes. I'm a pilot. So we used to fly little airplanes because we got sick of driving. And then sometimes some of the guys would want to come with me in the plane because they were sick of riding around in cars. So I used to like to pull ribs on guys in the airplane and scare the shit out of them. I remember one time some guys like Tony Atlas and some other guys, but I would take them up in the plane and we'd be flying along. As soon as they got comfortable and relaxed, because we'd be flying along nice and smooth, when they weren't looking, I'd lean out the fuel mixture, and all of a sudden the engine would go puh, 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 and stop, and the propeller would just be sitting there, and the plane was dead quiet. And I'd look like I was panicked. I'd go, oh, my God, the engine broke, we're going to crash. And the guy, I'd scare the shit out of them. They'd be screaming, but they couldn't do nothing to me because they never messed with the pilot. And then after a while, I turned the engine back on and laughed. But that used to be a big thrill for me.
That's funny.
And then when I landed the plane, I'd have to run away so they wouldn't hurt me.
Now, where can fans get a hold of you, or where can promoters get a hold of you?
What?
I said, where can fans or promoters get a hold of you?
You know what? Without giving my phone number out over the air, friends of mine set up a Facebook thing. So you can send me a message on Facebook, Larry Zbyszko. And I'm not good with Facebook or computers, but I know how to check. So I check sometimes, and it's sometimes I get booking because someone will send me a message on the Facebook.
Okay. Andrew, any last questions?
Yeah, Larry. I understand, the whole reason you wanted to come on is because you're talking about Chris Jericho a little bit earlier. I understand you have something a little more direct to say about Chris Jericho, so the floor is yours.
Chris Jericho. My friends caught me off guard the other day because there's some guys hanging out at the house because we got a bunch of video games, and all of a sudden they said, hey, Jericho knocked you in a book. I thought it was a rib. I said, what are you talking about? So they said, yeah, they said you were the worst announcer ever, and Chris Jericho was knocking me because he couldn't get over when Vince was trying to push him, so he wanted to call himself the living legend, and I wouldn't let him. So then Chris Jericho goes on in this stupid piece of shit book he wrote, talking about, "Oh, Zbyszko's a horrible announcer, and I wanted to be the living legend, but he wouldn't let me, and I was going to do a good T-shirt, but then I wound up with a crummy T-shirt because I couldn't call myself the living legend, and my T-shirt didn't sell good." What a piece of crap he is. Here's some kid that's 5'7", should be thankful Vince even gave him a break. Why? I have no idea. They tried everything. They gave him 20 belts. He still couldn't draw. And now this scumbag has the audacity to blame me. I'm the horrible announcer because he couldn't sell a T-shirt. What a piece of shit he is. And like I said before, in fact, me and Scott just did a last call talking about Chris Jericho. Because here's a guy that doesn't realize this wrestling business is not about Chris Jericho selling a T-shirt. This business is about the wrestling fans. If it wasn't for the fans, there would be no Chris Jericho. There wouldn't be no business. And it's too bad that these guys that, can't get over always blame somebody else instead of looking in the mirror and saying, I got a chance, but I just couldn't get over because I'm not that good. And that's the story of Chris Jericho. Obviously, and then we do a last call with Scott Hall, and Scott Hall said in his first book, he knocked Scott Hall. And then we did a last call over a match where Scott Hall and the NWO actually put the little puke over when the office didn't want him to because Scott knew it would get a pop. And the little prick stabbed Scott Hall in the back, too. But it all kind of stems to, some of these guys who really lost connection with what the business is about. And unfortunately, Jericho's one of these pathetic little pukes who think the business is about him. And he doesn't realize or have any respect for the fact that the business is about the fans. It's not about him selling a T-shirt. He has no respect for the fans. He has no respect for the business. He has no respect for tradition and the guys that came before him that busted their ass for 20 years so there would be a business for some little punk like Chris Jericho to even get a break he didn't deserve. And it's funny because, what is it, 5'6"? I think he's just tall enough so when Vince Jr. and Triple H and Stephanie McMahon stop walking, his face can go right in their ass and he can start kissing. And he must have kissed a lot because I don't know what Junior was on back then. But he gave the kid 90 belts, and Jericho bombed at everything he tried. And instead of saying, well, but I just wasn't big enough, I wasn't good enough, he said, oh, no, it's Zbyszko's fault. Larry wouldn't let me steal his name, and I couldn't sell a T-shirt. That's what he wrote in his book, this moron. It's my fault he couldn't sell a T-shirt. What a pathetic punk he is. Pussy punk.
I don't remember ever seeing you with a T-shirt.
Who cares about a T-shirt?
Right.
You care about the popping the crowds. So it's unfortunate, but he showed his true colors, and he's just some kind of spoiled little prima donna who thinks the business is about him and not the fans, and can't figure out, can't put the blame on himself. So not only did he, stabbed, me in the back. It's my fault that he couldn't sell a T-shirt and get over. He even stabbed Scott Hall in the back and knocked him after Hall helped him out. What an ungrateful sack of shit he is. I ever see this kid, I'm going to slap the piss out of him.
And to clarify for the fans, that's the same Chris Jericho you can now see on Dancing with the Stars.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a good play. I heard he's bombing out in that too. but that's a good play for him. Chris Jericho, just keep dancing, because that's more your speed. Let guys like Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar do the wrestling. You do the dancing. In fact, your band sucked too. So anyway, but I mean, unfortunately, with the world coming to an end, the economic collapse pending, people in Japan, Haiti, suffering untold agonies with these earthquakes. And, the powers that be are now engineering World War III in the Middle East. It's a complete waste of time talking about Chris Jericho anymore. But unfortunately, he's just an ungrateful little puke and, thinks that he's supposed to be God's gift to wrestling. But it's someone else's fault he can't sew a T-shirt. What a piece of crap. Anyway, that's a pathetic, part that some of these guys, unfortunately wind up. But, let them dance on TV. I mean, it's more his speed. Dance and go away.
To me, that just really goes to show the difference between the old school, your era, and then the young, and I guess Chris Jericho's not even really a younger guy anymore, but the younger generation.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's totally lost. There was an era of guys, from Lex Luger and some other guys who just came into the business, didn't know how to wrestle, didn't know psychology, but they didn't care. They didn't love the business. They just stood there and said, "Where's my big contract? I should make money because I don't know a goddamn thing, but I'm on roids." I mean, it was pathetic. And unfortunately, that's why the business is in the position it's in now, where the ratings are low, the buy rates are horrible, and most of the young people are watching the Ultimate Fight. And why a lot of tough guys like Brock Lesnar and some other guys, they don't want to be wrestlers because, idiots like McMahon and Russo are going to turn these tough guys into little dancing moron idiots doing skits. They don't want to be involved in that. These guys are tough guys, like wrestlers used to be. They'd rather do, they'd rather do the Ultimate Fight than dance around like little morons, for McMahon. I don't blame them.
Well, Larry, do you have
too bad.
Do you have any final words for your fans, Larry?
Fans, yeah, I love you, and my generation loves you. I know Scott Hall loves you. Check it out, Last Call Scott Hall. And, hopefully we'll get TNA going and bring the wrestling business, back to life a little bit. So, but, again, keep your eyes open for the Dead by Friday movie. It's coming out soon. And Adventures of Larry Land. You can get it right on Amazon.com.
And our fans will hear you this Saturday talking a little bit more about WCW on our tribute.
Yeah, we did that the other day, and I can't wait to see that WWA thing. That was fun.
Yeah, we'll get a hold of you after we go off the air and get that to you. And Larry, thanks for joining us this evening.
All right, guys. Well, you have a good day, and we'll talk to you soon. JT, we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, man. Hopefully, going to be bringing you up here soon. We'll have to talk about that when we go off the air as well.
Okay, buddy.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.